Have you ever made a choice so practical it starved your soul? For Clara Beaumont, that choice was a name, Duchess. She traded her heart for a title, marrying the cold and enigmatic Duke of Blackwood for the one thing he could offer her, unbreachable security. Standing in a ballroom dripping with diamonds and deceit, she was his wife, in name only a beautiful ornament in his powerful world. But she was about to learn that the coldest duties can ignite the most scorching confessions, and a single kiss, unexpected and raw, would shatter her carefully constructed reality and prove more dangerous than any poverty she had ever feared. The grand ballroom of Ashford Manor was a universe unto itself, a swirling galaxy of glittering chandeliers, silks, and whispered ambitions. From her position near the soaring marble columns, Clara, the newly minted Duchess of Blackwood, felt less like a celestial body and more like a captured moon forced into an orbit around the formidable sun that was her husband, Duke Gabriel Ashford. For 3 months, this had been her life, a performance of wifely perfection in a marriage that was nothing more than a meticulously crafted contract. She watched him now as he spoke with Viscount Montgomery, his profile severe and handsome under the warm candlelight. Gabriel was a man carved from granite and duty. He moved with an economy of motion that bordered on intimidating his dark eyes, missing nothing. He had never been cruel to her. In fact, he had been scrupulously correct, providing her with a lavish home, a breathtaking wardrobe, and the unassailable protection of his name. In return, she was expected to be flawless, charming, and above all discreet. She was the Duchess, a role she played with the desperation of someone who remembered the chilling draughts and gnawing hunger that had preceded it. Her family, the once proud Beaumonts, had been ruined by her father's misplaced trust and reckless investments. Marrying the Duke of Blackwood wasn't a choice. It was a rescue mission. She had saved her mother from destitution and her younger sister Alice from a life of drudgery. The price was her own freedom, her own heart, which she had carefully locked away. She looks the part, I'll grant her that... A voice, thin and laced with venom, drifted from behind a potted palm. Clara froze, her gloved fingers tightening on her ivory fan. But everyone knows the Beaumonts were practically begging on the streets. She's a clever little sparrow to have landed in such a golden cage. The voice belonged to Lady Penelope Croft, a woman whose own family fortune was notoriously precarious. Her companion, a portly baron, chuckled. Blackwood needed a brood mare, and she has the breeding if not the funds. A fair trade, I suppose. He gets an heir, she gets to eat. The words struck Clara like physical blows. A brood mare. A sparrow in a cage. The humiliation was a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. She knew people whispered. She knew they saw her as an upstart, a fortunate pauper who had ensnared the most powerful and elusive duke in the country. She didn't let her composure crack, instead, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, the bubbles fizzing uselessly against the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Her security felt as fragile as the crystal glass in her hand. A shadow fell over her, and she looked up into the piercing blue eyes of Lord Frederick Harrington. He was handsome in a way that always set her teeth on edge, too smooth, too practiced. He had been a suitor once before her family's complete collapse, and she had found his advances cloying even then. "Your Grace," he said, his voice a low purr as he bowed over her hand. His lips lingered a fraction of a second too long on her knuckles. "You are looking particularly radiant tonight. The Ashford diamonds suit you." He made it sound as though she were merely borrowing them. "Lord Harrington," she replied gently, retrieving her hand. "It is a pleasure to see you." It was a lie, and she suspected he knew it. I must confess I was surprised when I heard of your marriage." He continued his gaze, sweeping over her with an unnerving possessiveness. "I always pictured you marrying for passion, not for position." The insinuation was clear. He was reminding her of her former vulnerability, of the desperation he had witnessed firsthand. "A woman's circumstances can change, my lord, as can her priorities." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed, but a person's nature rarely does. You have a fire in you, Clara. I hope the Duke doesn't extinguish it with his cold sense of duty." Before she could formulate a reply, Gabriel was there. He hadn't seemed to move, but he was suddenly beside her, a formidable presence that instantly dwarfed Lord Harrington. His hand rested lightly proprietarily on the small of her back. The touch was impersonal, a public signal of ownership, yet it sent a shiver through her. "Harrington," Gabriel said. His voice was flat, devoid of warmth. "I trust you are enjoying the hospitality of my home." "Blackwood." Harrington greeted his charm, faltering for a moment under the Duke's icy stare. "Of course. Your new Duchess is a credit to you. We were just reminiscing about old times." "My wife is concerned with the present, not the past." Gabriel stated his tone, leaving no room for argument. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, met Clara's. For a fleeting instant, she thought she saw a flicker of something other than cool detachment, a possessive glint, a warning. He was dismissing Harrington, but he was also staking a claim on her. It was the move of a chess master protecting his queen, not a husband protecting his wife. Yet the distinction was becoming blurry and unsettling. "As you say, Duke," Harrington conceded, giving a stiff bow before melting back into the crowd. The moment he was gone, Gabriel's hand dropped from her back, and the space between them once again felt like a chasm. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual formal cadence. "I am perfectly fine, Your Grace." She answered the title, a reminder of the distance between them. He gave a curt nod, his gaze already scanning the room, assessing his guests, managing his world. "Good. The ambassador from Prussia will be arriving shortly. I will need you by my side." As he turned away, Clara felt a profound sense of isolation wash over her. Lord Harrington's words echoed in her mind. A sparrow in a golden cage. She was safe, she was secure, but she was utterly alone. She looked around the magnificent ballroom at the laughing, dancing aristocrats, and realized with a sickening certainty that the cage was not the Ashford name or the grand manor. The cage was the lie she was living, and her jailer was the stranger she called her husband. The evening wore on a symphony of polite conversation and orchestrated pleasantries. Clara performed her role as Duchess with practiced ease, smiling, nodding, and ensuring that every guest of consequence felt acknowledged. Yet beneath the surface, a current of unease pulled at her. Lord Harrington's presence was a constant low-grade threat, and the memory of Lady Penelope's cruel words was a fresh wound. The crisis, when it came, was small but potentially disastrous. The newly arrived Prussian ambassador, a stern man named Baron von Hesse, was a known connoisseur of Renaissance art. Ashford Manor housed one of the finest private collections in England, and Gabriel had arranged for the Baron to view a particularly prized painting by the Venetian master Tintoretto, which hung in a quieter salon adjacent to the ballroom. Clara was speaking with the wife of a parliamentarian when a commotion erupted from the direction of the salon. A young footman, pale and trembling, rushed to Gabriel's side, whispering frantically. Gabriel's face hardened, and he immediately moved towards the salon, the crowd parting before him like the sea. Curiosity piqued, and duty calling, Clara excused herself and followed. Inside the salon, a small group had gathered. Baron von Hesse stood stiffly, his face a mask of thunderous disapproval. On the floor beneath the Tintoretto lay the shattered remains of a heavy porcelain vase that had been on a nearby pedestal. A dark, spreading stain of water and crushed flowers marred the priceless Persian rug, and worse, a long, ugly splash of water had arced upwards, streaking across the bottom corner of the Tintoretto's gilded frame and darkening the ancient canvas itself. An outrage! Baron von Hesse boomed, his German accent thickening with anger. Such carelessness is unforgivable. This masterpiece, potentially ruined. Gabriel's jaw was tight, his eyes cold as steel as he surveyed the damage. My sincerest apologies, Baron. The servant responsible will be dealt with severely. A young maid was sobbing in the corner, being held up by the head housekeeper. It was an accident. Your Grace Lord Westerfield stumbled back. He bumped the pedestal. Lord Westerfield, a notoriously clumsy and intoxicated earl, was attempting to look indignant. Nonsense. The girl was careless with her dusting earlier, I'm sure of it. Loosened the thing. The situation was escalating, threatening to become a full-blown diplomatic incident. The Baron looked ready to storm out, and the reputation of the House of Ashford for impeccable order was at stake. While Gabriel's mind was clearly on punishment and control, Clara's went elsewhere. She remembered her father, an amateur historian, teaching her about art restoration. He had a particular fascination with the Venetian masters and their techniques. Stepping forward, she moved past her husband and curtsied deeply to the furious ambassador. Baron von Hesse. She said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. This is indeed a terrible accident, and my husband and I are mortified. However, I believe the damage may not be as catastrophic as it appears. All eyes turned to her. Gabriel shot her a look of sharp warning, a silent command not to interfere. She ignored it, a spark of defiance igniting within her. She was more than just a decoration. She knelt beside the painting, careful not to touch the rug. The Venetian masters of this period. She began addressing the Baron directly, her knowledge lending her an unexpected authority, often used a specific gesso preparation made with rabbit skin glue as a base. Furthermore, Tintoretto was a pioneer in using oil-based varnishes that were highly water-resistant. The water has darkened the canvas, yes, but it is unlikely to have penetrated the layers of varnish and paint to cause permanent damage to the pigment itself, provided it is treated immediately and correctly. She rose and turned to the head housekeeper. Mrs. Gable, please fetch several pieces of clean, dry linen. No rubbing. We must blot the moisture gently. And send someone to the library to fetch my father's monograph on Venetian pigment preservation. It is on the 3rd shelf, bound in green leather. The housekeeper, stunned for a moment, simply stared. It was Gabriel who broke the silence. Do as the Duchess says. Now. His voice held a note of something Clara had never heard before surprise. Baron von Hesse watched Clara, his expression shifting from anger to grudging respect. You are knowledgeable, Your Grace. My father believed that to truly appreciate art, one must understand its creation and its vulnerabilities, Clara replied smoothly. We will of course have our private restorer examine it tomorrow, but I am confident the painting will not suffer. She had taken control of the chaos, transforming a moment of public failure into a display of quiet competence. She had not only saved the painting, but had also soothed the ruffled feathers of a key political guest. The whispers in the room were no longer about her family's poverty, but about the Duchess's surprising expertise. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed and the Baron had been pacified, Clara was in her private sitting room, preparing to retire. A soft knock came at the connecting door that led to Gabriel's chambers. It was the first time he had ever sought her out in her private space. He entered, still in his formal evening wear, looking exhausted, but formidable. He closed the door behind him, and the room which usually felt like her only sanctuary suddenly seemed very small. "The painting is drying," he said, his voice low. "The initial assessment suggests you were correct. The damage is minimal." "I'm glad," she whispered, her heart beating a little faster. He stood there for a long moment, studying her. The silence stretched thick with unspoken thoughts. She expected him to leave, to offer a perfunctory thanks, and retreat back into his world. Instead, he took a step closer. "What you did tonight," he said, his voice losing some of its rigid formality, "was impressive. You averted a significant embarrassment. Thank you, Clara." He had used her given name. In 3 months of marriage, he had never called her Clara. She was always Your Grace or my wife in public, and they were rarely alone, long enough for any name at all in private. The sound of it on his lips was strangely intimate. "I only did what I thought was necessary, Your Grace." She replied her own formality, a reflex. "Gabriel," he corrected her quietly. "When we are alone, my name is Gabriel." The offer was a crack in the formidable armor. He wore a tiny fissure in the wall that separated them. She looked up at him, at the man who was her husband, and for the first time she saw not just the Duke of Blackwood, but a man. A man who could be surprised. A man who perhaps was just as lonely in this grand house as she was. It was a fleeting thought, a dangerous one, but it planted a seed of curiosity in the barren ground of their marriage. That night, for the first time, she didn't feel entirely like a sparrow in a cage. She felt like a duchess who had just discovered she had wings. The Duke's use of her name, the brief, unguarded moment of gratitude, lingered with Clara for days. It was a small thing, yet it had subtly altered the climate of their marriage. The air was still cool, but the biting frost had receded. Gabriel was no less reserved, but his glances held a new quality of assessment, of curiosity. He started joining her for breakfast, a meal he had always taken alone in his study. Their conversations were stilted, revolving around estate matters and social obligations, but they were conversations nonetheless. A fragile hope began to blossom in Clara's chest. Perhaps this arrangement could be more than a cold contract. Perhaps in time it could become a partnership, even a friendship. It was this budding optimism that made Lord Harrington's next move all the more devastating. At a garden party hosted by the Marchioness of Devon, Clara found herself momentarily alone in a secluded rose arbor, seeking refuge from the relentless chatter and the afternoon sun. The scent of blooming roses was thick and sweet, a peaceful balm to her senses. A duchess in hiding. How delightfully scandalous. The voice was Frederick Harrington's. Clara turned, her brief moment of peace shattering. He stood at the entrance to the arbor, blocking the path, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "Lord Harrington, I was merely admiring the flowers," she said, her tone cool and dismissive. "Were you? I thought perhaps you were contemplating your extraordinary change in fortune," he said, stepping closer. The confined space of the arbor suddenly felt suffocating. From near penniless obscurity to the Grand Duchess of Blackwood, it is quite the fairy tale. I am content with my life, my lord. Are you? He let out a low, humorless laugh. Contentment is for dairymaids, Clara. You were made for passion, for intrigue. You are merely playing a part, and I wonder how long you can sustain the performance before your powerful, dutiful husband discovers the truth of his bargain. A cold dread washed over her. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do, he murmured, his eyes glinting with malice. He was close enough now that she could smell the wine on his breath. I know all about your father's unfortunate investments. I know that the man he trusted, a certain Mr. Davies, was not just a business partner. He was a swindler who left your father with debts so vast they would have seen him thrown into Fleet Prison for the rest of his days. Clara's blood ran cold. This was the secret she and her mother had guarded so fiercely. It wasn't just debt. It was the shame, the gullibility, the utter ruin of their name. "That is a private family matter," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to control it. "It becomes my matter when I am the one who holds Mr. Davies's debt ledgers," Harrington said softly, delivering the killing blow. "Every last one of them. Imagine the scandal. Duke of Blackwood's father-in-law, a bankrupt fool, swindled by common criminal. How would that sit with the high and mighty Ashfords? How would your proud husband react knowing he married not just into poverty, but into disgrace? The world tilted on its axis. Harrington had been orchestrating this. He had likely hounded Mr. Davies to acquire those ledgers. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a calculated attack. "What do you want, Frederick?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. His smile widened. "That is a much better question. For now, let us say I require a friend at court. An ally. The Duke of Blackwood has influence I could find useful. He has blocked my appointment to a trade commission twice now. I would like you to persuade him to see things my way. Speak of my acumen, my value. Be my advocate in his bedchamber." The vulgar insinuation made her feel physically ill. "Never. The alternative is seeing your family's name dragged through every gossip column in London." He hissed his charming facade, dropping completely. "Your mother disgraced. Your sister's marriage prospects ruined forever. And your Duke, he is a man who values honor and reputation above all else. Do you truly believe he would stand by a wife whose family is a laughingstock? Your security is not as unbreachable as you think, Clara. It rests on a foundation of lies, and I am the only one who can keep it from crumbling." He reached out and brushed a stray curl from her cheek. His touch felt like a violation. "Think about it. A word in his ear is all I ask, for now." With a final meaningful look, he turned and strolled out of the arbor, leaving her alone with the suffocating scent of roses and the poison of his threats. She leaned against the trellis, her legs threatening to give way. The hope that had begun to grow in her heart was crushed, replaced by a suffocating terror. She saw Gabriel from across the lawn, standing tall and straight, the very picture of aristocratic power and integrity. The gulf between them, which had seemed to be narrowing, was now an impassable canyon. How could she possibly tell him she had married him under a false pretense, omitting the true depth of her family's shame? To confess now would be to admit she had deceived him from the very start. He would see her not as a desperate daughter trying to save her family, but as a conniving fraud. He would despise her. He would cast her out. The security she had paid for with her freedom would be revealed as a mirage. Harrington was right. Her entire world was built on a lie, and he had his hand on the trigger that would blow it all apart. She was trapped more completely and terrifyingly than she had ever been before. The carriage ride back to Ashford Manor was a silent, agonizing affair. Clara sat opposite Gabriel, the plush velvet seat feeling like a block of ice beneath her. She stared out the window at the passing London streets, but saw nothing but Lord Harrington's triumphant, cruel face. Every word he had spoken was a brand on her mind. "He blocked my appointment. Persuade him. Your security is not as unbreachable as you think." Gabriel, ever observant, broke the silence. You have been quiet since we left the party. Did Lady Devon's insipid chatter finally wear you down?" There was a hint of dry humour in his tone, a new and tentative intimacy he had been testing between them. Clara couldn't muster a response. She simply shook her head, keeping her face turned away, praying he wouldn't see the panic in her eyes. He did. When they arrived at the manor, he didn't head for his study as usual. He followed her up the grand staircase. "Clara," he said, his voice stopping her at the entrance to her chambers. "Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, she turned. The gaslights in the hall cast long shadows, making his handsome face seem carved and severe. But his eyes were not cold. They were filled with an intense, searching concern that unnerved her more than his anger ever could have. "You are pale," he stated. "You are trembling. This is not about Lady Devon. This is about Harrington. I saw you with him in the rose arbor." Her breath hitched. "He was merely offering pleasantries. I have known Frederick Harrington since we were at Eton," Gabriel said, his voice dropping low. "He has never uttered a pleasantry in his life that wasn't a prelude to a strike. What did he say to you?" "Nothing." She lied, her voice weak. "It was nothing of consequence." "Do not lie to me," he commanded, not with anger, but with a raw, frustrated edge. "I will not have it. Not from you." The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming. He saw too much. He saw her fear, and it seemed to agitate him, to stoke some protective fire she couldn't comprehend. Why did he care? Theirs was a marriage of convenience, a contract. Her personal fears were not part of their agreement. "It is my own affair," she insisted, turning to open her door. "It has nothing to do with you." His hand shot out, not touching her, but resting on the door beside her head, blocking her escape. He leaned in his proximity, overwhelming her senses. He smelled of clean linen and the crisp night air, a scent that was becoming dangerously familiar. "Everything that distresses my wife has to do with me," he said, his voice a low growl. "Everything that puts that look of terror in your eyes is my affair. Now tell me what he did." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, tears of fear and frustration and a desperate, aching loneliness. "I can't." "Why not? Do you not trust me?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and painful. Trust him. She had married him for his name and his money. She had hidden the true, shameful extent of her family's ruin from him. Trust was a currency she did not possess. Seeing the conflict warring on her face, a strange, desperate look crossed his own. It was as if her silence was a physical barrier he was trying to break through. He had spent his life building walls, and now, faced with hers, he seemed utterly lost. "Clara." He breathed, his voice suddenly thick with an emotion she couldn't name, and then he did the last thing she ever expected. He closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her. It was not a kiss of duty like the chaste, sterile peck he had given her on their wedding day. This was a desperate, searching, almost brutal kiss. It was a kiss born of pure frustration and a possessive instinct that stunned them both. His mouth claimed hers with a hunger that belied his cold exterior, one hand tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck, holding her fast, while the other braced against the door. For a moment she was frozen in shock. Then something inside her, the part of her she had locked away for so long, fractured. The loneliness, the fear, the crushing weight of her secrets. It all seemed to dissolve in the raw, stunning heat of his touch. This was not the Duke of Blackwood. This was Gabriel. And his kiss was not a demand for submission, but a desperate, unspoken plea for connection. It felt like a confession of a loneliness that mirrored her own, a confession of a protective instinct that went far beyond the terms of their contract. A confession of a desire he had clearly been suppressing, a desire that now erupted with volcanic force. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing heavily. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed, his expression one of pained confusion, as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. "Tell me," he whispered, his voice ragged. "Let me help you." The kiss had changed everything. It had shattered the formal artifice between them, exposing the raw, complicated emotions churning beneath the surface. It was no longer a question of duty or contracts. He had offered her a glimpse of the man behind the title, a man who felt things with a terrifying intensity. And in that moment, she realized with a jolt that her carefully guarded heart was no longer safe. The kiss had breached her defenses as surely as it had breached his, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that she was beginning to fall in love with her husband. The echo of the kiss resonated in the silence of the hallway. It had stripped away their titles, leaving them as just a man and a woman caught in a moment of raw, unplanned vulnerability. Gabriel's plea, "Let me help you," was not a command from a duke, but a request from a man who seemed just as lost as she felt. Clara knew she could no longer hold back. The kiss had been a confession on his part, and now the truth must be hers. The risk was immense. He could still recoil in disgust, his nascent feelings curdling into contempt, but to keep lying now felt like a greater betrayal than the original omission. "Not here," she whispered, her voice unsteady. He straightened up, his expression still tense, but he nodded. He followed her into her sitting room, the familiar space now charged with an electric, unfamiliar tension. She didn't light the lamps, leaving the room in the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. She took a steadying breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to stop their shaking. "You were right. It was about Lord Harrington. He knows about my father." She began to speak the words, tumbling out in a torrent of shame and fear that she had held back for so long. She told him everything, not just the debts, but the humiliating details, her father's blind trust in a con man, the forged documents, the way their friends had abandoned them overnight. She confessed that their situation was not just one of genteel poverty, but of utter, scandalous ruin. "Harrington has my father's debt ledgers." She finished, her gaze fixed on a loose thread on the damask sofa. "He threatened to make them public. He wants me to influence you, to persuade you to grant him the trade commission appointment you denied him." She finally dared to look at him. She expected to see cold fury, the rigid disapproval of a man whose pristine name she had sullied. She braced herself for the dismissal, the quiet, cutting words that would end her security and her fragile, budding hopes forever. But Gabriel was not looking at her with contempt. His face was a mask of cold, controlled rage, but it was a rage that was utterly and terrifyingly still. It wasn't directed at her. It was aimed squarely at Frederick Harrington. "The man is a viper," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He began to pace the length of the room, his controlled energy making the space feel even smaller. "To use your family's misfortune against you, it is the lowest form of cowardice." Clara stared at him, bewildered. "You're not angry with me. I kept this from you. I let you marry into this disgrace." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing with an emotion she was beginning to recognize as a fierce, all-consuming protectiveness. "Angry that you were desperate, that you did what you had to do to save your family from a debtor's prison. No, Clara, I am not angry with you. I am furious that you were put in a position where marrying me seemed like your only option." I am furious that you have been carrying this burden alone." The sincerity in his voice undid her. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, and gently, almost hesitantly, brushed it away with his thumb. His touch was warm, a startling contrast to his formidable reputation. "There is something you do not know about Frederick Harrington," Gabriel said, his voice hard. "Our families have been rivals for generations, but it is more personal than that. 10 years ago, when my father was still the Duke, Harrington's father attempted a hostile takeover of our shipping interests. He used blackmail and industrial espionage. My father nearly lost everything. We defeated him, but the stress of it took a great toll on my father's health. He never fully recovered. I learned then that a Harrington will stop at nothing to gain power, and they have a particular hatred for my family." The revelation was stunning. This wasn't just about a trade commission. It was a continuation of an old war, and Harrington had chosen her as his new weapon. "He tried to use my family's ruin to ruin you." She breathed, the full scope of Harrington's malice becoming clear. "He tried to use you." Gabriel corrected his gaze, intense. "And that is a mistake he will live to regret. He thought you were my weakness, the chink in my armor. He is about to discover that you are my fortress." The words hung in the air, a declaration so profound it left her breathless. My fortress. He saw her not as a liability, but as a source of strength. In that moment, the last of her fear of him evaporated, replaced by a powerful surging wave of emotion. It was more than gratitude. It was a deep, resonant connection to this complex, guarded man who had just claimed her as his own in a way the wedding vows never could. He saw the look on her face, the dawning of a new understanding between them. Their shared enemy had not driven them apart. It had forged a bond of fire and steel. "He will not harm you or your family," Gabriel stated, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "I will not allow it. He wanted you to be his advocate in my chambers. He has no idea that you have just become his judge and jury." He offered her his hand. Without hesitation, she placed her own in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and sure. It was no longer the impersonal touch of a duke, but the protective, possessive grip of a husband. Together they would face the storm. They didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, at a lavish ball, hosted by the Earl of Pembroke, a known political kingmaker, Gabriel put his plan into motion. Clara entered the ballroom on his arm, and for the first time, it did not feel like a performance. The way he held her, the quiet words of reassurance he'd spoken in the carriage, the shared purpose that now existed between them, it was all real. She was not his duchess, in name only. She was his partner. Lord Harrington was holding court near the grand staircase, laughing with a group of influential ministers, including Sir Robert Peel, a man whose opinion could make or break careers. Upon seeing them, Harrington's eyes lit with a triumphant gleam. He clearly believed Clara had bent to his will. Gabriel guided her through the glittering crowd, not towards Harrington, but towards Sir Robert himself. "Sir Robert," Gabriel said, his voice calm and pleasant. "A pleasure to see you. You know my wife, the Duchess." "Of course," Sir Robert said, bowing to Clara. "Your Grace, you are looking as lovely as ever." "You are too kind, Sir Robert." Clara replied, her voice steady, drawing strength from Gabriel's presence beside her. Harrington approached them, his smile slick. "Blackwood and the lovely Duchess. I was just telling Sir Robert about my proposal for the new trade commission to the Americas. I believe my experience in transatlantic shipping would be an invaluable asset." He looked expectantly at Clara. This was her cue, the moment he had been waiting for. Gabriel gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, signalling for her to begin. Clara turned to Sir Robert, her expression one of polite concern. "Lord Harrington's interests in shipping are indeed well known, Sir Robert. In fact, my husband and I were just discussing them." Harrington preened. "Were you now?" "Yes." Gabriel cut in smoothly, his tone deceptively casual. "We were remarking upon the ambition of his recent acquisitions. Tell me, Harrington, how is the North Star Line faring? I heard a rumor that 3 of your ships were turned away at the port of Boston due to cargo inconsistencies. Very costly, I should imagine." A flicker of panic appeared in Harrington's eyes. The group of ministers fell silent, their attention now fully on the exchange. "Idle gossip, Blackwood." Harrington scoffed, but a bead of sweat had appeared on his temple. "Business rivals will say anything." "Perhaps," Gabriel mused, "but my sources at Lloyd's of London are rarely idle. They also mentioned the underwriters are reconsidering your policy premiums, citing unacceptable risk. It seems you've leveraged your family's entire fortune on securing this new South American route, a route that would be dependent on, say, a government commission." The color drained from Harrington's face. Gabriel wasn't shouting or making accusations. He was laying out facts cold and precise for everyone to hear. He was dismantling Harrington's reputation brick by brick. Clara picked up her own cue, her voice filled with practiced innocence. "Oh dear. That sounds terribly precarious, Lord Harrington. One would hope anyone appointed to a position of such national trust would have their own affairs in impeccable order. The risk of temptation, of being compromised, would be far too great, wouldn't you agree, Sir Robert?" Sir Robert Peel, a man for whom financial integrity was paramount, looked at Harrington with new suspicious eyes. "Indeed, Your Grace, financial stability is a cornerstone of public trust." The trap had been sprung. Gabriel had not exposed Harrington's blackmail of Clara. He had used Harrington's own greed and overreach against him. He had made him appear not just corrupt, but incompetent and desperate. From across the room, Clara saw a figure watching the entire exchange with shrewd, intelligent eyes, the Dowager Duchess, Eleanor Ashford. Gabriel's mother had always treated Clara with a cool, reserved civility, making it clear she was being weighed and measured. Now, as the ministers began to subtly distance themselves from the flustered Lord Harrington, the Dowager Duchess met Clara's gaze. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but it was monumental. It was a sign of acceptance of respect. She had seen Clara not as a weak link, but as an active participant in the defense of their family's honor. Harrington, realizing he had been utterly and completely outmaneuvered, shot Clara a look of pure venom. But there was no fear in it for her anymore. His power over her had been an illusion built on her shame and her secrets. With the truth shared between her and Gabriel Harrington was nothing more than a desperate man who had played his hand and lost spectacularly. "If you'll excuse us," Gabriel said, taking Clara's arm once more. "My wife and I were about to dance." He led her to the center of the floor as the orchestra began a waltz. He took her in his arms, and they began to move a silent, perfect accord between them. The eyes of the entire ballroom were on them, but for the first time, Clara felt no need to perform. "He won't trouble you again," Gabriel said, his voice low and for her ears only. "By morning, his creditors will be circling like sharks. His political ambitions are finished. You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her heart swelling, with an emotion so powerful it almost overwhelmed her. "You could have just paid him." "His quarrel was with my family," Gabriel replied, his stormy eyes fixed on hers. "But his crime was against you." and I will allow no one to harm my wife." As he spun her around the magnificent ballroom, Clara knew her life had irrevocably changed. She had married the Duke for security, a shield against the world. But in his arms, surrounded by the wreckage of their enemies' ambitions, she understood she had found something infinitely more precious. She had found a man who would not just shield her, but would stand and fight beside her. She had found a partner. She had found a home. The final notes of the waltz faded, and a polite wave of applause rippled through the ballroom. But for Clara and Gabriel, the world had shrunk to the space between them. The whispers and stares of the London elite no longer mattered. They had faced down their demon together, and in doing so had forged an unbreakable alliance. They spent the rest of the evening as a united front. The chill that had once defined their public appearances was gone, replaced by a quiet intimacy that was far more powerful than any grand display of affection. A shared glance, a light touch on the arm, the way he stood just a little closer to her. It was a new language they were learning together, a language of partnership and trust. When they finally departed, leaving behind a ballroom buzzing with the news of Lord Harrington's spectacular fall from grace, the silence in the carriage was no longer tense or awkward. It was comfortable, filled with the quiet hum of shared victory and unspoken understanding. Arriving back at Ashford Manor, the great house no longer felt like a gilded cage to Clara. It felt like a sanctuary. As they ascended the grand staircase, Gabriel did not stop at her door. He continued with her, following her into her sitting room, the same room where her confession had unraveled just nights before. He closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. The moonlight once again streamed through the windows, bathing the room in a silvery glow. "Clara." He began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping gardens. "When I proposed marriage, I did so for the reasons everyone assumed. I needed an heir. I needed a duchess to manage my households. It was a transaction meant to secure the future of my line." He turned back to face her, his expression stripped of all its ducal severity. He looked vulnerable, a sight she never thought she would see. "I told myself it was enough," he continued. "My parents' marriage was an arrangement, as was theirs before them. I believed duty and respect were the most one could hope for. I built walls around myself. Clara walls I thought were impenetrable. I thought I wanted a wife who would be quiet, biddable, and undemanding. A wife who would not challenge those walls." He took a step towards her, his eyes searching hers. "I was a fool. From the moment you walked into my life, you challenged everything. You were not biddable. You were resilient. You were not quiet. You had a fire and an intelligence that you tried to hide. I found myself watching you, listening for your opinion, feeling a pull that I did not understand and did not want to acknowledge." His confession mirrored the one she'd had in her own heart. He had been just as lost, just as guarded as she was. "That night you saved the painting," he said, a small wry smile touching his lips. "I saw more than just a knowledgeable woman. I saw a partner. And when Harrington threatened you, the thought of him hurting you, of you being afraid, it was intolerable. It was then I realized that my duty was no longer just to my name or my title. My primary duty is to you." He was standing before her now, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He gently took her hands in his. "I am sorry, Clara," he whispered. "I am sorry I offered you a contract when what you deserved was a marriage. I am sorry I gave you security when what you needed was a sanctuary. I can't change the reasons we began, but I can promise you with everything that I am, that our future will be built not on duty, but on this." He raised her hand to his lips, but instead of her knuckles, he pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her palm, then curled her fingers over it, as if to hold the gesture there. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but this time they were tears of profound, unadulterated joy. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Gabriel. You saved my family. And tonight you saved me." "No," he corrected gently, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "Tonight we saved each other." He lowered his head and kissed her. There was no desperation in this kiss, no frustration or anger. It was tender and deep, a kiss of infinite promise. It spoke of shared futures, of whispered secrets in the dark of breakfasts, shared not out of novelty, but out of a genuine desire for companionship. It was the kiss of a man who had finally allowed himself to feel to love. And Clara kissed him back with all the love she had locked away in her heart, a heart that now beat only for him. She had married the Duke for security, a practical solution to a desperate problem. But standing here in the arms of the man she now knew as Gabriel, she understood that true security wasn't found in a title or a fortune, or the unbreachable walls of a grand estate. It was found in the fortress of a shared heart, in a kiss that was not a duty but a home. The ballroom had been their stage, the place where their public lie was on display. Now, in the quiet moonlight, their real life was just beginning. Clara awoke to the soft morning light filtering through the heavy silk curtains of her bedchamber. For a moment, she lay still the events of the previous night, feeling like a vivid, impossible dream. The tension of the ball, the venom in Harrington's eyes, the cold dread that had seized her, it all seemed to belong to another lifetime. It was the memory of Gabriel's kiss, tender and full of promise, in the moonlit sitting room that felt real. That felt permanent. With a newfound lightness in her step, she dressed, choosing a simple morning gown of pale blue muslin. As she descended the grand staircase, a familiar anxiety fluttered in her stomach. Would the light of day bring with it the return of their old formality? Was the confession in the dark a fleeting moment of vulnerability, or the foundation of something new? She entered the breakfast room, a bright, sun-drenched space where they had recently begun to share silent, stilted meals. Gabriel was already there, seated at the head of the table. But he wasn't hidden behind the morning paper as he usually was. He was watching the door, waiting for her. When his eyes met hers, he smiled. It was a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his severe features and made her heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar pang. "Good morning, Clara," he said, his voice warm. "Gabriel." She returned the smile, feeling it reach her own eyes for the first time in his presence. She noticed the room was unusually quiet. The footmen who normally stood sentinel by the sideboard were absent. A silver coffee pot and a spread of pastries and fruit were laid out, but there were no servants to be seen. "I took the liberty of dismissing the staff," he explained, rising from his chair to pull out the one beside him, not opposite him, but next to him. "I thought we might appreciate the privacy." The gesture was more intimate than any public declaration. He was carving out a space, just for them, away from the prying eyes and listening ears of the household. As she sat, she saw a sealed envelope resting by her plate. Her name was written on it in Gabriel's sharp, decisive hand. "What is this?" she asked, her fingers hesitating over the thick parchment. "Open it." He encouraged his gaze, soft. She broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter not from him, but from a solicitor. It was a formal notice stating that the outstanding debts of her father, Mr. Charles Beaumont, held by a consortium of creditors, had been settled in full by an anonymous benefactor. The ledgers Harrington held were now nothing more than worthless paper. Her family was free. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, a wave of overwhelming gratitude washing over her. "Gabriel, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said simply, his hand covering hers on the table. "Your peace of mind is not a trivial matter to me. Your family's security is my security. There will be no more threats, no more shadows." She could only whisper, "Thank you." He poured her a cup of tea, his movements easy and natural. "I was also thinking," he said, changing the subject to spare her from becoming overwrought, "about what you said that night of the Prussian ambassador's visit, about your father's interest in art preservation." She nodded, intrigued. "The Ashford collection is vast and frankly poorly catalogued," he admitted. "It has been managed by curators who see it as a job, not a passion. I was wondering if you would be interested in taking over its curation. You have the knowledge, the eye for it. It would be your project entirely." Clara was stunned. He wasn't just offering her a distraction. He was offering her a purpose, a role in his life that went beyond being a duchess. He was acknowledging her mind, her talents. He was seeing her. "I would love that," she said, her voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. "Good," he said, his smile returning. "Then it's settled." He passed her the plate of pastries and their fingers brushed. The small touch sent a jolt of warmth through her. They sat there for an hour, talking more than they had in their entire 3 months of marriage, the morning sun streaming in, illuminating a future that suddenly felt bright and full of possibility. The grand passions and dramatic confrontations of the ballroom had given way to something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more precious. This was not the end of a dramatic story, but the peaceful, sunlit beginning of their life. Clara and Gabriel's story began as a contract, a marriage born from necessity and sealed with duty. She sought the security of his name, and he a duchess to fit his station. But within the gilded cage of their lives, they discovered that the most formidable walls are the ones we build around our own hearts. Their journey from strangers to partners shows us that true security isn't about wealth or titles. It's about the profound trust of knowing someone will fight for you and the courage to let them. It's about the moment a touch is no longer a performance, and a kiss is no longer an obligation, but a confession that changes everything. If you were moved by Clara and Gabriel's journey from duty to devotion, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who loves a story of unexpected romance. Subscribe to our channel for more tales of drama, passion, and the confessions that change everything. What did you think of the Duke's Gambit? Let us know in the comments below.